Hello guys, my name is Hassan Kingsley and I'm a penultimate year student at Cambridge reading Human, Social and Political Sciences. So as you must already be aware, we've released a number of videos on this channel in relation to the core ideologies for the Politics A-level exam. We've looked extensively at conservatism and also socialism. So for today's video, we'll be looking at the final core ideology that you must learn about for your exam, which is liberalism. Now, before we begin, I just wanted to show you guys what textbook we're actually working through. So this is the textbook that we're working through. And as always, we'll be looking at the ideologies through the lens of the thinkers. So this is the textbook that I used for my examinations. It ultimately got me an A star and into Cambridge. Yeah, so just before we continue, I wanted to say that Suki is here, the Pomeranian. So she is also studying for her A-levels this year. So if she does bark in the background, that means she probably agrees with the point I've made. Or maybe she's just getting tired. So please do ignore her if she does make any noises. So, starting off with liberalism then. Now, as with the other ideologies we studied, we looked at conservatism and socialism. We know that they are split into a number of schools. So with conservatism, we have three major schools. We have traditional conservatism, we have one nation conservatism, and then finally new right conservatism. For the socialism ideology, we have four major schools. We have revolutionary socialism, we have evolutionary socialism, we have social democracy, and third way socialism. So as we know, with the ideologies, they're split up into a number of splinter groups. So with conservatism, we had three major schools: traditional conservatism, one nation conservatism, and also new right conservatism. And then with socialism, we had four major schools. We have revolutionary socialism, evolutionary socialism, social democracy, and third way socialism. Now with liberalism, in the same way, we have two separate groups. The good thing about liberalism is that there's only two though. So those are the only ones that we need to go over. So let's start off by looking at the first major school, which is classical liberalism. Now, classical liberal ideas largely emerged during the age of the Enlightenment. That was around the 18th century, based upon rationalistic ideas of science, of philosophy, that were trying to challenge the established order of things, whether that was the political order or the religious order, and how governance was being undertaken at that time. So classical liberal ideas very much influence the modern democracies that we live in today in the West. So some of the ideas that classical liberals enshrined into their philosophy was government by consent, for example. So that meant that any government that was in power must have the approval by those individuals it was governing from. If it did not have that approval, then it had no legitimacy and it should not be authorized to govern, particularly if that government was working against its people, if it was tyrannical or if it was coercive in nature. Classical liberals also advocated for a guarantee of individual freedom. So that meant individuals in society should be able to do whatever they wished as long as they did not cause any harm to others. So freedom to act. Thirdly, they advocated for representative democracy. So that was the idea that individuals in society should be able to vote for those that are in power over them, rather than being governed by individuals who inherited power, such as in a monarchical system. They also argued that the state should play a very limited role in society and the economy. And this was a principle known as negative freedom, or freedom from. And these are key words and phrases that you should be referencing in your examination, because like we said in the previous videos, these are what the examiners are looking out for, and these are what will get you top marks. So that basically means that they think that the government should not intervene in the lives of the people. And the less the government intervenes in the lives of the people, the better it is for people, because that means they have more freedom and they have a greater capacity to do what they want without the government coercing or directing their action. Classical liberals also believe, and this is the final point, that individuals are born with natural, inalienable rights. That basically means that every individual, irrespective of who you are or where you come from, your socioeconomic status, your background, race, religion, culture, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. Everybody has the same basic foundational rights. We'll be going through what those rights actually are later in the video. Now, modern liberalism was somewhat different. Whilst classical liberals are saying, well, let's have a very limited role for the state in society, modern liberals are actually favoring more interference of the state in society. So they're saying it's actually a good thing for the state to intervene because this will enhance individual freedom. And modern liberalism, for many modern liberal thinkers, is a logical continuation of classical liberal ideas. Now, the reason why they think the state should intervene is because they argue that if the state doesn't intervene, many individuals who are from poorer backgrounds, who are living in deprivation, who are struggling with marginalization in society, will not be able to access the same opportunities as wealthy, more affluent, and rich individuals are. So it's necessary for the state to intervene by providing, for example, basic welfare, by providing shelter and housing, by providing free education, for example, to assist those individuals, to give them a hand up, to enable them to do well for themselves. And that's why modern liberals often term the state that they envisage as an enabling state, a state that assists you, that provides you with help in actually achieving what you set out to achieve. So as we did with conservatism, we looked at the core values that conservatives champion, and so we did with socialism too. The core values for conservatism were things like tradition, custom, pragmatism, individual freedom, autonomy, hierarchy. For socialism, it was more so equality, it was more so egalitarianism, freedom, community, and things as such. In the same way, liberalism also has a number of core ideas and principles. One of those key principles is individualism, and that is the notion that individual freedom and rights are the most important thing that could be championed by the state. So John Locke, for example, who we'll be looking at later in the video, argued for foundational equality. So let me just define what that means for you. Foundational equality is a fundamental belief that all individuals are born with natural rights that entitle them to liberty and the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain. In liberal states, like for example in Western Europe, like the country we live in the United Kingdom and in America, this often translates into the rule of law. And that is the idea that everybody, irrespective of who you are or where you come from, will be treated the same. It doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are, everybody has to abide by the laws of the country, and they are all held accountable according to the rule of law. So if a rich person murders someone, they will get the same punishment as a poor person. That's how it should work in a liberal democracy. Now, egotistical individualism is the idea that individual freedom is associated with a rational sense of self-reliance and self-interest. So classical liberals would say that if the state doesn't intervene in society, egotistical individualism would lead individuals to work hard for themselves so they can create a good life for themselves, a good quality of living, an affluent living. So they might go out to work, they might set up a business, they might engage in enterprise, they might engage in the corporate world and get a good job. And this is good for them. It's happening because the state doesn't intervene, so the state doesn't take responsibility for them. They take responsibility for themselves. They go out and work, and that leads to them living a good, prosperous life. Now, another key principle for liberals is freedom and liberty. Freedom, liberals argue, is intimately connected with the law. Locke said, where there is no law, there is no liberty. And this actually is interesting because it goes back to the point Thomas Hobbes was saying. Thomas Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, there is no liberty. So if we were to establish a state, then in that state there would be the rule of law, and that would give people liberty and freedom. At least liberty and freedom in relation to others, liberty and freedom in relation to not being invaded from an alien or foreign force. Therefore, for liberals, when we do have the rule of law, that means we are more free to act in the way that we want without any fear of having our rights encroached upon. Now, they also believe that freedom is a natural right. So Locke argued the role of government was to protect people's right to life, liberty, and estate. Estate just meaning private property here. The state is needed to mediate between competing individuals to enforce order, to protect property rights, and to prevent breach of contracts and fraud. Now, although classical liberals argue for a limited state, they are not anarchists. They don't argue that there should be no state. They do believe the state is essential. And one of the key reasons why the state is essential is to uphold contract law. So if you were to make a contract with somebody, the state would uphold that if they were not to keep their end of the bargain. And that's vitally important. Locke also argued that absolute monarchies were illegitimate and instead believed that the state should be based upon a social contract. Now, we looked a bit at the social contract when we studied Hobbes in the conservatism video. But the social contract is a very straightforward concept. It's the idea that the state is based upon a contract between the government and those that are governed. And the government agrees to hold itself accountable to the people who it is governing. And it will operate under the rule of law. That means those that are being governed and those that are governing will both be subject to the rule of law. The state's primary responsibility is to uphold the law and also protect its citizens. Now, another key concept for liberals, particularly classical liberals, is limited government. Now, that is the idea that the government should be limited and not encroach upon the rights of individuals by being too interventionary. This is very much closely connected to the idea of laissez-faire, whereby the government, it's a French term, whereby the government is essentially saying nothing to do with us, that individuals should be free to act in the way that they want, and when it comes to the economy, the government should not interfere at all to allow the free market to operate and to allow individuals to make as much wealth as possible. So, now that we've had a look at the core values and principles that all liberals hold tightly to, we're now, as always, going to look at the ideology through the lens of the thinkers. Now, the reason why I keep talking about the thinkers in these videos is because you must reference them in the examination. For Edexcel, for example, if you do not reference the thinkers, you will be limited to a band 2, and that's 9 marks maximum out of 24. That is something, of course, we're not aiming for. We want to get 24 marks. Also, another point I wanted to add in relation to the examination is a lot of students think that they can wing it and get away with just going over 1 or 2 ideologies. If you want to write an A-star essay, you need to thoroughly understand all of the core ideologies. Now, that's not the same for the peripheral ideologies like nationalism, feminism, ecologism, or multiculturalism or anarchism. You can pick one of those and just revise one of those and you'll be fine, because the question is particularly on one of those ideologies. But when it comes to the core ideologies, you could be asked on any of them. You could be asked a question on conservatism, on socialism, or liberalism. We don't know. And it's not a good idea to predict what is going to come up anyway, because, like I was saying earlier, to get the best mark, you need to know all of them thoroughly. Reason being, even if you get a question on liberalism, let's say, if you can then make a connection point, a synoptic link they often call it in the mark scheme, then you'll be able to get more analytical and evaluative marks. So it's vitally important to know all of the ideologies quite thoroughly and in depth, which is why we've made all of these videos for you to understand them properly. So we'll be looking at our first thinker, John Locke. So he was born in 1632 and he died in 1704. He wrote the work 2 Treatises of Government, and that was published in 1689. So let's look at some of his main ideas. So if you are using the textbook, and I would actually recommend when you're watching my videos, use the textbook as you're watching them, because what we're doing is actually going through the textbook. And I think it's one of the best ways to actually relay information. Why? Because a lot of students read the textbook and don't actually understand what's being said. So what I'm doing here is reading the textbook to you, going over the ideas and explaining them to you as well. So currently we're on page 279 in the textbook, so you might want to flick over there. So it says here, Locke's main ideas were that the state was not created by God. So already we've got a clear contrast with traditional conservatism, because conservatives were saying, there is a natural hierarchical order, and if there is a monarchical order, that is legitimized through something we call the divine right of kings, whereby God says that here's the king, I say that he should govern, he governs on my behalf, and he's the most powerful individual here, and he has a right to rule over you because I said so, because God said so. Locke saying, I'm not having any of that. There is no state that was created by God. He says the monarchy also is not legitimized by the idea of the divine right of kings. So the divine right of kings is also another key phrase you want to memorize. It's just the idea that if there is a monarch, whether that be a king or a queen, they argue that their legitimacy and their authority to govern derives from the fact that God said they should be able to do that. The divine right, essentially. Locke doesn't like that. He's not having any of it. He says rather the state is actually created via a social contract between the rulers and the ruled. And this is the principle of government by consent, something we looked at earlier in the video. So what he's effectively saying is, look, there is no divine right of kings. If there is going to be people who govern us, it's going to be through a social contract. The people who are being ruled say, yes, we agree to you being our ruler, and you will rule in our favor and in our interest. And this is what we call government by consent. It is legitimized by the fact that we say you can rule over us. In modern states, this is often done through elections. Now, this is another very intriguing point. Second point here. He says, prior to the existence of the state, humans existed in a state of nature. A phrase that he actually borrowed from Thomas Hobbes. For those of you who have watched our video on conservatism, you know what Hobbes said about the state of nature. He had a very pessimistic, negative outlook on the state of nature. So this was the idea of what existed, what environment was present prior to the emergence of the state. He said it was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short, chaotic, hellish state of constant warfare. He said it was a terrible place to live. Now, Locke has borrowed this phrase, but the way that he's envisaged the state of nature is very different to what Hobbes was saying. He's saying that this state of nature was actually quite pleasant. There was natural laws, natural liberties, and natural rights. So the state of nature that existed prior to the emergence of the state is actually a very positive one for Locke, not a negative one. And this goes into the way that liberals often see human nature. Liberals have a positive, optimistic view of human nature, seeing them as rational, logical, coherent beings. Whereas conservatives, of course, particularly the traditional and one nation school, have a very negative and pessimistic outlook on human nature. And because of that view on human nature, Hobbes is saying the state of nature was terrible, everyone was fighting, there was killing, there was murder, there was pillage, not a nice place to be. Locke is saying, no, human beings are rational, they are intelligent, they're clever, they're logical beings. It was a great place to be. So the question then arises, if the state of nature was a great place to be, why on earth create a state? Well, Locke actually answers this question. He says that these freedoms were extremely desirable and so the state must not encroach upon them. So these freedoms already existed, but the state's responsibility is actually to further entrench those freedoms. How does it do that? Well, it upholds the rule of law. So if somebody comes and attacks you, you can ring the police, say, hey, this guy's hit me, I want to take him to court for GBH or whatever. In other terms, it could be contract law. If there is no state and somebody's broken a contract, the state is much better placed to actually act as an arbiter between two individuals who are at odds with each other. It's much more amicable to resolve something in court than to resolve something in an informal manner. So Locke is actually saying the state is actually a better way of arbitrating between individuals rather than doing it without the existence of the state. So beyond that point, Locke defined natural rights as life, liberty, and estate. Natural rights are negative rights, the right not to be subject to interference by another person or the state. This is connected to the idea of negative freedom, we talked about that earlier, which is a central principle for both classical and neo-liberalism. For Locke, government was legitimate only if it was legally protecting natural rights. So Locke is essentially saying here that the state should not intervene in the rights of the people. It should leave the people be, and that is the best way to preserve their freedoms, to preserve their liberties, to preserve their autonomy. The more the state intervenes, the less freedoms you have. He also says that the state of law that he envisaged would see the state resolve disputes between individuals more equitably than can be achieved within a state of nature. So that's similar to a point we made earlier, that if we do have this state of law, whereby the state does exist, it's a better placed institution to deal with disputes amongst individuals. The state's interference in society and economy should be limited. This would ensure that the states always represented the interests of the governed and always required their ongoing consent. The states should be limited under the principle of constitutionalism, with a clear separation of powers to prevent an abuse of power. So Locke is saying here that the state's interference in society should not only be limited in terms of what it does for people, but also in terms of the economy. It should not interfere in how the economy is governed. And he said the government should always represent what the people want. And this is often produced through representative government and general elections, which hold the government accountable. The state is limited through constitutionalism. So this links back to America and the United States Constitution and the principle of limited government. That was established through the Constitution, clearly delineating a separation of powers, each branch of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, acting as a balance on the other and as a counteract to make sure that one does not become too powerful over the other branches and therefore does not encroach upon the rights of the people. So he also believed in the separation of powers, and he understood this to stop an abuse of power. He also said that there should be tolerance of diverse religious and political views. So if individuals, were of a different political affiliation or belief, that is absolutely fine. If individuals from different religions lived in the same state, that is also absolutely fine. Why? Because we should be tolerant. And he believed that the best ideas would naturally emerge on top. And this should certainly not be something which leads individuals to be at odds with one another. So, that is John Locke. The second thinker we are going to look at is John Stuart Mill. He was born in 1806 and he died in 73. His key work is on liberty, and that was published in 1859. Now, in terms of what school he fits into, John Stuart Mill is actually quite interesting. Just like we looked at Edmund Burke, who we said fitted somewhat into traditional conservatism and somewhat into one nationism, John Stuart Mill is pretty much the same in the fact that he somewhat fits into classical liberalism, but also somewhat fits into modern liberalism. So his main ideas we'll run through now. Mill argued for a restraint by the state, meaning that individuals should be free to take whatever actions they judge fit, provided they did not cause any harm to others. And this became known as the harm principle. So Mill is saying, look, anyone can do whatever they want in society, right? They could be a Christian, they could be a Muslim, they could be a Buddhist, they could be a Sikh, they could be a Hindu, they could be heterosexual, they could be homosexual, they could be bisexual, they could be transgender. He's saying it doesn't matter. As long as you're not causing harm to others, it's absolutely fine. This is the type of society that Mill is envisaging. He distinguished actions. He said some actions are self-regarding, other actions are other-regarding. Meaning some actions impinge on the freedoms of others. And these would be the other-regarding actions, whilst others are self-regarding. They're personal. They don't actually affect others at all. Now, he said that self-regarding actions are absolutely fine. This might be what you do in your home, in private. That is your prerogative, your preserve. It's not something that anyone else should be concerned with. But other regarding actions can be a problem because they might be things like being violent, being involved in riotous behavior. And he said that those actions should not be tolerated by the state. Why? Because they impinge upon the freedoms of others. So if you're doing something in your home in private, that's not necessarily impinging upon other people's freedoms. But if then you go outside onto a public road and try and block it, that's impinging free travel for other people. So he said the state here should actually intervene and stop people from reducing the freedoms of others by, for example, limiting them in what they can do. So self-regarding actions, other-regarding actions, keywords. And once again, you should reference these in your examination. He also said, like any classical liberal would, that the state should be tolerant of all opinions, of a diverse range of opinions. And Evelyn Beatrice Hall kind of summed this up by saying, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So that is the idea that, look, you can say whatever you want, we have free speech, and I might not necessarily agree with you. You might be a Christian, and you might be having a debate with a Muslim, let's say. You might not necessarily agree with what they say. You might be a conservative having a debate with a liberal. You might be a Republican having a debate with a Democrat. You might be a member of the Conservative Party having a debate with a member of the Labour Party. You might not agree with what they're saying. But you should not advocate to have their right to say that infringed upon or taken away. So he's advocating here for free speech, essentially, that everyone should say whatever they want, as long as it's not a call to violence or a call to harm. So beyond that, he also believed that individual liberty was essential for the development of the individual in terms of creativity, culture, and intellect. If individuals were able to develop their individualism, their whole of society would benefit. This is very interesting. So what he's saying here is that, look, if we leave individuals be and not intervene, that would actually be most beneficial to society, because that would create and allow them to flourish in terms of their intellect, in terms of how creative they were, and also in terms of their culture. So he says, leave individuals be, leave them alone. They might become a scientist, they might become an engineer, they might become a diplomat, they might become a lawyer, and that will benefit everyone in society. But if the state starts intervening and kind of directs action, then that creativity, that flourishing would be infringed upon. It would be reduced. So this is something that he's arguing against. Unlike earlier liberals who thought that human nature was a finished article, so what's being said here is that human nature is complete, it's rational, it's logical, it's coherent, and that's the end of it. He actually believed in developmental individualism. And this is the idea that, look, human nature is not essentially concretized, it's not set in concrete, it's not something that is stagnant. It's not something that would always stay the same. You could develop yourself. You can become a better individual. How so? Through education, let's say. Through better refinement of manners. Through reading books, for example. Through developing yourself. So he says that individuals can become a better version of themselves. They're not just confirmed in the version that they were as they were, for example, when they were children or as young adults. You continuously are on a road to improvement. Now, what's interesting about John Stuart Mill is that he actually opposed popular democracy. So for those of you looking at UK politics, you would have looked at direct democracy, which is the idea that everyone votes directly on issues. He wasn't really a fan of that. He's saying that this would crush the interests of the minority because the majority would always get what they want. Instead, he supported representative democracy within the paradigm of limited government. He said the representatives would aggregate the demands of all of the individuals and therefore create a broad consensus for decision making rather than always following what the majority wanted. So he says that mass education was a means to facilitate developmental individualism so that only the educated could vote and those with a higher level of education could have multiple votes. So all of a sudden we've got something very interesting going on here. A very great analytical point for your examination. We generally associate with the liberals that they're saying, well, everyone should have the right to vote. You know, they say representative democracy. But here Mill is saying he doesn't support popular democracy. He supports representative democracy. Okay, that's fair enough. We have representative democracy now. But he then goes on to say that only those who are educated should vote. So what about those who don't go to university? What about those who didn't go to school? He then also says that those who have a higher level of education should have multiple votes. And I think that's a great analytical point because whilst generally liberals are supportive of representative democracy, and that means universal suffrage so that everyone gets the vote, Mill is actually not really in favor of that. You know, he has this kind of tiered voting system whereby educated people vote, non-educated people don't really vote, and then those who are higher educated have multiple votes. So this is something that you can evaluate in your examination, and we'll be dropping more videos on our channel in how to incorporate all this information that I'm giving you here into your examination, which is vitally important, so definitely keep an eye out for those. And our final point on Mill now. Although Mill argued that government should interfere as little as possible in society and the economy, he later kind of changed his ideas. He said that the state must intervene to help individuals attain developmental individualism. How so? By facilitating education. He saw these ideas, which influenced modern liberalism, as a natural continuation of classical liberalism and not a contradiction. So a lot of contenders, individuals who try to detract from modern liberals, say that they are not remaining true to classical liberalism because they are advocating for more state intervention. But John Stuart Mill is not having that. He's saying, look, this is not against classical liberalism because classical liberalism wants freedom. But for an individual to be truly free, they should have a good education because then they can go on to get a good job, earn a good income, and then be free. If we see a person that's homeless, can we actually say that they're truly free? This is what modern liberals are basically arguing. Poor people aren't truly free because they don't have the money to do what they want. If we actually want freedom, we need to provide these individuals with a basic standard of living. And we can do that through providing them with education, which is what Mill is arguing here. And once again, great analytical point because his ideas are changing. Traditionally, he was more so a classical liberal, but when he kind of grew older and he refined his ideas, he became more so a modern liberal. So definitely draw that contrast in your examination. So without further ado there, we move on to the next thinker, which is Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft is a thinker that I studied in quite some depth in my second year at Cambridge. And I'm currently revising her because we're taking examinations for her this May. So she was born in 1759 and she died in 97. And her key work was A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and that was published in 1792. She also wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Man, that was published in 1790. Another work she published was Maria on the Wrongs of Woman, that was published posthumously after she died. So she wrote many books, and she's a very intriguing thinker. Now, her main ideas were largely associated with feminism. So she also often pops up within the feminist school when individuals are studying feminist ideology. But she's very useful here as a modern liberal thinker. She had a very positive view of human nature, and she viewed men and women as equally rational. She argued that this truth was ignored by contemporary state and society, as women were denied formal equality under the law, which gave them considerably fewer rights than men. So she actually was a very strong proponent of female education. I remember a quote from a book. She said, "Strengthen the female mind by enlarging it, and there will be an end to blind obedience." Blind obedience in the sense that women were always obeying what men were telling them. But she believed that if women were given a proper education, they would truly be able to fulfill their duties in society by understanding what their rights were. She said all citizens should enjoy equality under the law and be free from discrimination. She also campaigned for a change in the law to give more women rights in terms of employment and also property ownership, something which women weren't expected to do at this time. A lot of women weren't in employment. The vast majority were just working as housewives. Their primary role was to be seen as homemakers, individuals who bear children and then raise them. She also argued that women should have the right to property ownership. Once again, this was very rare. It was only the extremely affluent and wealthy women that had property. The majority of women weren't even permitted to own property in their own right. She also said that they should retain legal freedoms when they were married. This was something, of course, that women did not have during the time she was writing in the 18th century. She also supported formal equality and the social contract ideas of Locke. She said that the divine right of kings was an absurdity, just as Locke was saying, and she also supported the American and the French Revolution, arguing for republicanism rather than a monarchical form of government. And like we said earlier, one of the key ideas that she advocated for was women's education. So she's very much a modern liberal thinker. Her thinking is orientated towards the rights of women, which I think is a great nuance that you can draw out in your examination because it's an outlier. It's talking particularly about the rights of women, which the other ideologies don't really focus too much on. So really draw this out when you are writing your essay. I'll show you how to do that in a video tackling a liberal question, which should be released on our channel in due course. Now, the next thing that we want to look at is Betty Friedan. So she was born in 1921, died in 2006. Once again, a female modern liberal thinker. So she was influenced by classical liberalism in terms of the importance of individualism, and also modern liberalism in terms of the importance of the enabling state. Her key works were The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, and also The Second Stage, which was published in 1983. So she argued strongly for individual freedom. In particular, she believed that individuals should be free to able to achieve their potential. Like Mary Wollstonecraft, she argued that gender was a serious hindrance to women as they were constantly discriminated against. She believed that women were victims of restricted opportunities within society because of patriarchal attitudes. So patriarchy is the idea that men are dominant in society, whether that be in politics, whether that be in education, whether that be in media, whether that even be in the home and in your private life. And she wanted to upend that and get rid of that and make sure that women were treated on par with men. She believed that because of patriarchy, women's opportunities were restricted, and this was something that she constantly was working against. Friedan was influenced by classical liberalism in a belief that if the state allowed equality of opportunity, then women's individual efforts could achieve the successful combination of marriage, motherhood, and career. Now, this is quite interesting because these classical feminist liberal thinkers like Betty Friedan, like Mary Wollstonecraft, were not that radical. It's interesting that she says women should be able to achieve the successful combination of marriage, motherhood, and career. It wasn't that these individuals were expecting women to just go out to work and leave their other responsibilities. like being, a housewife, looking after the home, for example, or being a mother. They still thought that that was very important, but that they should also have the same opportunities as men to go with that, without abandoning their more so conventional duties, particularly as they were seen at that time. She was also influenced by the ideas of modern liberalism. Like Rawls, she felt if utilized properly, an enabling state could assist women in being free. The state would counter dominant patriarchal values that discriminate against women and ensure foundational equality and, of course, equality of opportunity in both the society and the economy. This would include state benefits for single, divorced or widowed mothers. So once again, she believes that the state should intervene in society. How so? Well, it could be in a number of ways. It could be through legislation, like the Sex Discrimination Act, which stopped discrimination against women in the workplace. It could be like the Equalities Act, which stopped discrimination against women who were pregnant, for example. It could be things like the Divorce Reform Act, which allowed women more rights in terms of divorce. So this legislation protected women's rights. It could also be things like providing more opportunities for women through positive discrimination, providing schemes through the government, for example, encouraging women to work in technology, engineering, and scientific subjects, more STEM-orientated avenues. This is something that women have historically been excluded from. So there's lots of different ways that women's rights could be promoted, both in society and through the economy. In society, more so through education. In the economy, possibly through legislation and positive discrimination. But also through things like welfare. She mentions things like providing benefits for single and divorced women. These individuals would largely be left alone if they were divorced and have no recourse to public help. She believed it was vitally important to support them if that was the case. So we had to take a little break there because Suki wanted some food. She's definitely been very good here, writing her notes for the topic. Revision snack, you might call it. So we do apologize for that. So the final thinker we want to be looking at today is John Rawls. So he also falls into the modern school of liberalism. He wrote A Theory of Justice, published in 1971. He was born in 1921 and he died in 2002. His key idea was justice as fairness, and he believed that everyone would agree to an enabling state and positive freedom if they were in a position of ignorance. Let me explain what that means. So many students that I've tutored in the past really struggled to actually understand what this means, but it's actually quite straightforward. So he's basically come up with a thought experiment. He's saying that, look, if you were to be asked before you were born, do you want to live in an equal society or an unequal society, then you would actually opt to live in an equal society where there was an enabling state. And he calls this the position of ignorance, or otherwise the veil of ignorance. So if you were ignorant about what you would end up as in life, you would opt for an enabling state because at least then you would have a basic standard of living. But if society was based upon classical liberalism, where there was greater amounts of inequality, then you could end up being extremely poor, which there are examples of people living as in the world today. So this is what he calls the veil of ignorance. Now, if you still don't understand that, that's absolutely fine. You could drop me a message. My details are available below this video, and I can explain that to you further and how to apply that to your essay writing. But beyond that point, he says an enabling state would provide a welfare system, which would include health and education. And his theory implies, as we mentioned earlier, that classical liberals, when oblivious to their personal circumstances, would always choose an interventionary state that guaranteed equality of opportunity, rather than a limited state that didn't. To the traditional idea of foundational equality, Rawls added the need for social and economic equality. So it wasn't just about having rights that were inalienable, it was also the idea that you should have the same equality when it came to society and also in terms of economic opportunity. He argued that a just society must provide equality of opportunity for everyone, and this could only be achieved by the state taking a larger role within society. Let me explain this to you. If you had a classical liberal society where inequality was absolutely fine, someone born into a poor family would not have education. Let's take my example. So I was born into a working class family, right? So my parents were doing semi-routine jobs, nothing special, typical working class. My mother was a homemaker. She didn't work. She looked after the children and brought me up at home. So effectively, when compared to other people, I was born into a poor family. So rich people, of course, they can afford education. A lot of rich people send their children to private school. But myself, my parents would not have been able to afford an education. But the state intervened and provided that education through taxation. So this is an example of that. And look what that ultimately led to. I ended up in the best university in the world. So this is what he's arguing for. He's arguing for educational equality, which would then result in individuals having a proper equality of opportunity. The only reason I'm in the position I'm now in is because the state intervened, provided education, I did well, and now I'm entering into a good job, hopefully after I graduate at university. He believed that this would be funded by progressive taxation, as it is today. The education system is funded by taxation upon wealthier people, which then pays for opportunities for poorer people. But that's vitally important if we are to be truly a meritocratic society where individuals can achieve whatever they want, irrespective of where they come from. But Robert Nozick, who was a conservative thinker, who we looked at in the conservative video at the end, he actually said that Rawls was betraying liberalism because his demands for an extensive interventionary state had more in common with socialism than it did with liberalism. Nozick's ideas were, of course, a part of neoliberalism, which is a modern version of classical liberalism, and he falls within the conservative school. But he very much opposed John Rawls because he's saying that, look, you've advocated for so much intervention that this is starting to look a bit like socialism. So this is quite interesting because here you can draw a very good contrast. You can contrast John Rawls' ideas and say how similar they are with socialist thinking, particularly with like third way socialism, whereby the state allows individuals to produce money and wealth. That wealth is then taxed and spent on public expenditure like education. These ideas are very similar. Make sure you draw those links to get a top mark in the examination, because those are the AO2 and AO3 marks that the examiners will be wanting to give out. So that brings us to an end of this video where we looked at liberalism as an ideology. As always, if you like the content here, please do like and share with your friends who may also be studying politics, or anybody in general who's interested in a basic overview of what liberalism is. As always, we'll be posting more videos in relation to examination technique, in relation to other content in the politics, sociology, religious studies, and history specifications for A-levels and GCSE. So definitely, please do subscribe to this channel to keep up with that. Otherwise, I hope you have a very good day, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.